I'm going to keep my comments short because I, like you, came to hear from these distinguished and very knowledgeable specialists in this area. I am not that, but I did want to think about the kind of modern context and bring a perspective of someone who focused on the middle period of the 20th century with my first book, and think about this idea of moving borders. And I think one thing that I took from looking at Deborah's wonderful, and up in the gallery, the wonderful map of 2G's expedition is how porous the borders were less than a century ago. And how we in America especially have, I think, institutions and the state have really accepted or reified the regional divisions that came out of the Cold War, right? So people like Ted DeBerry, who started the East Asian, sort of the core program up at Columbia, and others at Harvard as well, came out of the war mentality. And there was East Asia and there was South Asia, and Tibet gets caught in between these. And I think one of the things we need to do is push to move these boundaries as scholars, not to accept the institutional boundaries that states or Cold War divisions push on us. And I'll point out some of the ways that these things have real-life effects in our understanding of things. At Columbia, and I think at universities, probably most universities don't collect Bhutanese publications, but at Columbia, the Tibetan librarian and the Tibetan collection is housed in an East Asian Studies library, and the Bhutanese material is collected somewhere else. And we pretend like these are different languages, and there's good reasons. I mean, the Bhutanese they can feel free to do that. They have their own reasons for doing that. But these languages are, the script is the same, the language is at least as much the same as Amdo Tibetan is to Central Tibetan dialect. And so to accept those divisions is to, basically means that whoever's collecting the Bhutanese materials can't read the materials that are coming in and doesn't know what they're collecting very well. And it's divided, this kind of collecting, at the Library of Congress as well, right? So for instance, the Library of Congress cannot purchase books from China, even though most Tibetan books are published in China. They have to make their way to Delhi in order to be published by the Tibetan language books from China, which is publishing like no other period in the history of Tibetan history, have to make their way to Delhi to be published by the Library of Congress. Or if someone happens to sell them directly to the library, a visiting scholar or a graduate student or something like that. And the other place I've seen this, maybe to be critical or to push our moving boundaries is at an institution, the main institution for digitizing Tibetan knowledge, at least in terms of funding, is the Tibetan and Himalayan Library at the University of Virginia at Charlottesville. So it's a highly federally funded program, and they've done something that I think the Ruwa Museum has done as well, Tibetan and Himalayan, dividing these two, as if there was some kind of natural divide, that Tibet is, and the Tibetan people who are south of the Himalayan mountains are somehow not Tibetan, and all these people who are in Amdo or Kham are somehow more obviously Tibetan. And it's a question, as I look at the sources at least, that these places that we now put together are treated this way. For instance, the Tibetan Himalayan Library maps all end at the Chinese border. The digitized maps that they have, although they include discussions in places, especially now that UVA is spending more time in Bhutan, they're engaging more with the Bhutanese community, but all their maps of the Tibetan areas end with the Chinese border, and that seems to me a very strange thing, and it's made it very difficult for me as someone who's spent time in Amdo and other places to even find maps of the places in Spiti and Nepal and Bhutan and Sikkim and so forth that I can integrate with my image of what is Tibet, because there are no maps for it. So we need to move, I think, technologically, we need to move our ability to map places like this south into the Himalayan regions and to understand that as part of Tibetan studies. And it's not, the idea here would not be to incorporate all these people. For instance, I'm thinking of people that we typically sort of allow to not be Tibetan, Sherpa, Bhutanese, people from Spiti. We don't call these people Tibetan. And I'm not suggesting that we incorporate them somehow in a greater Tibetan community. But I think by the same token, we might question whether people in Amdo or Kham, or especially a place like Gyalrong, that always gets included as part of Tibet, whether these people are Tibetan, and if so, when did they become Tibetan? And let those voices speak to us in current day terms, but also in the past. Look at the sources and see when did these places become Tibetan. We see, as was discussed, the border of Tibet being discussed, but the Tibetanness of the people within that terrain doesn't get discussed so much. So that's my thought in terms of moving the borders, I think it's just something I want us to all be aware of. On other notes, in looking at the images that I saw today and thinking about the area that I know in northeastern Tibet, I wondered whether we might speculate about the kind of influences from urban centers, the square or the rectangular walled temple complexes that you see at Tuttle are mirrored in temple complexes on the eastern borderlands. Drotsang, that Carl studied, a place named Tsomokar, where Shakya Yeshe, the founder of Sera Monastery in central Tibet, was buried. His body is actually buried at this kind of cultural border in Amdo. And these are fortress temples. I don't know if the purpose of the walls at Tuttle was to protect the monastery from invasion, but in the eastern cases, it certainly was. And so there's a kind of urban influence that's coming in this way that I don't think we've sort of adequately looked at. We've also neglected all the dzongs in central Tibet, all the fortified places. If we paid attention to the 13 hierarchies, but probably over 24 fortified sites in central Tibet, I think people would not have the idea that Tibetans were a peace-loving people. There's many castles in central Tibet as there are along the Rhine in Germany, right? This was a fortified place. People were competing over resources, but we, tend to not pay attention to those places. And finally, I want to turn to Lo and Hua and go in a different direction and talk about moving beyond technological borders, because the work that you're showing with these images and the ability to go to a site and extract, and to replicate those images and produce them is really impressive. And I would love to see, you make these. I don't know if the plan is to make these available, but I would certainly use it. I think many other people would use it to teach Tibetan art, and this intersection, this appropriation of cultures east and west, and explore these ideas and map them, so to bring them to a world stage. So I think it's a really great place to sort of end this, the technological moving of the borders, and I hope you make this material available on the web somehow for the rest of us to study. And I'll just leave it there with my comments and hope that you have other questions for the speakers. Thanks.